Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I am the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. This is the 27th year of the Glenbard Parent Series. I'm so delighted that you are all here for this very special and very important presentation. This would not happen without our annual sponsors. You just saw the slide, our community partners. If you are listening in from anywhere in the United States, please do share. If you are local as well, like us on Facebook, share this free, now weekly virtual resource for families of children of all ages. I'd like to tell you quickly about what is upcoming. This is a very busy fall for the Glenbard Parent Series. And next week, we will be hosting Ronnie Cohen-Sandler. She has a fun and important book called Anything But My Phone Mom, Raising Resilient Kids in the Digital Age. That will be next week, Tuesday at noon and repeated at 7 p.m. And then the week following after that, we're going to help families be sane around college admission when we host Rebecca Sabke. She has an important book called Valedictorians at the Gate. The week after October 6th, that it will be at 7 p.m. We're very excited about welcoming back to the Glenbard Parent Series, Madeline Levine. I know she's a very good friend of Dr. Koplewicz, so that'll be fun. Madeline will be talking about her book, her very important books, and the topic this time is Success is Not a Straight Line, a beautiful follow-up to today's presentation, Skills to Thrive in Trying Times. Well, please go to the website, glenbardgps.org. Take a look at the 50 programs that we have scheduled for this year, programs in English, programs in Spanish, programs in Gujarati and Hindi. So please spread the word. I'd like to talk about the format this morning. Dr. Koplewicz will speak for about 50 minutes. This recording will be available afterwards. For the noon event, the Q&A and the chat are disabled. They will be open at 7 p.m. If you would like to email any questions to Gilda_Ross, we will be able to answer them hopefully in the 7 p.m. hour. And this gives you a chance to make a phone call this afternoon and let someone know that they need to be listening in. This is a very special opportunity. These two books are some of my favorite on the shelf. You'll be hearing more about these two books because Janet Cook, our Assistant Superintendent of Student Services, who will have some words at the end, is going to be introducing Harold now. Janet, take it away.
Thank you, Gilda. I'm honored to be able to introduce Harold Koplewicz. He's the founding president and medical director of the Child Mind Institute, the only independent national nonprofit dedicated to child and adolescent mental health. One of the leading child and adolescent psychiatrists in the United States, Dr. Koplewicz was previously founding director of the NYU Child Study Center and served as director of the Nathan S. Kline Institute for Psychiatric Research. He's frequently turned to as an expert on youth mental health by leading media outlets, including NBC, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. He is the author of several books, including Scaffolding Parenting, Raising Resilient, Self-Reliant, and Secure Kids in an Age of Anxiety from Penguin Random House. The Child Mind Institute's award-winning website at childmind.org has 2 million unique visitors each month and has brought accessible information to more than 68 million parents, teachers, and mental health professionals, as well as launching celebrity social media campaigns like Dare to Share that reach more than 250 million people each year. Dr. Koplewicz is a leader in international children's mental health efforts, working with the Stavros Nicaros Foundation to create the Children's Mental Health Initiative, a collaboration between the Child Mind Institute and Greek mental health professionals to improve access to care, capacity, and mental health literacy and awareness. I'm so excited to hear what Dr. Koplewicz has to say, and so excited to know that this is getting to our Glenbard families. Thank you, and Dr. Koplewicz.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, but I'm delighted to be with all of you and to talk about some very important topics that are affecting our children and our teenagers in an age of post-COVID. So why don't we start with a few slides that are going to give you some background about the Child Mind Institute. We're going to be talking about more than Moody, the whole concept of teenage depression, which is more than moodiness and more than teenage angst. Can I have the next slide, please? So the Child Mind Institute, as Janet just said, is an independent nonprofit. The way to think about this is our country has always paid a lot of attention to child physical illnesses. We have great institutions like St. Jude's Research Children's Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, that for more than 50 years has tackled childhood cancer. We have the Joslin Clinic up in Massachusetts for diabetes. And yet, the most common set of disorders of childhood and adolescence, as reported by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Pediatrics, is mental health disorders, not infectious disease, not diabetes, and not cancer. In fact, we need an independent institution that is truly invested in transforming the lives of these children and doing it in a very comprehensive way. Next slide, please. Our mission includes gold standard care, which is driven by diagnosis because treatment needs diagnosis, education, and science. Next slide. So what's been happening at the Child Mind Institute is that we've been going on for 13 years, but then COVID came, and COVID really tackled us and made us change the way we think about disease and how we can deliver care. Next slide, please. So importantly is that because of COVID, every child's mental health was at risk. That didn't mean that every child in America had a mental health disorder, but every child was definitely more stressed, was certainly more moody, was certainly more nervous, and certainly more inattentive than they were before. So what are we going to talk about today? We're talking about why we're seeing so many depressed teenagers, what's typical moodiness versus real depression, and when to be concerned about what you are seeing, and also the basics of how scaffold parenting can help kids when they're in trouble. Next slide, please. So the prevalence of depression, about 20% of teens experience depression before they reach adulthood. So think about that for a second. That means 1 out of 5 teenagers. And we think that teenage years go all the way to 24. There's a reason why Hertz rents you a car at 25 and not at 18, because finally your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain underneath your forehead, is connecting to the rest of the brain. You start to learn about cause and effect. You actually realize that putting on a seatbelt is a good idea, that wearing a helmet makes sense, that there's a reason to protect yourself against pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases, and that's why condoms are necessary. And yet before that, risk is always minimized and opportunity is always maximized for most teenagers. And 30% of teens with depression also develop substance abuse problems. Very often, they start to treat their underlying sadness, their underlying irritability. 15% of all college students meet the clinical criteria for depression, and less than half of them receive treatment. So think about this. While you're listening to me, if you develop a rash, as soon as the talk is over, you're going to put some high tone or cortisone on that rash. You're going to go over to your local drugstore. If it's not gone within 2 days, you'll go over to see your doctor. And if it's not gone in 2 weeks, you'll see a dermatologist. And yet we wait somewhere between 2 and 8 years from the onset of symptoms when it occurs in kids or teenagers till they get treatment, 2 to 8 years. The bad things happen during those 2 to 8 years. Bad things happen to the teenager's brain, and bad things happen to their personality and the way they get to live their life because of depression. Depression, by the way, is more prevalent in teens than in children and adults. So what does that mean? It means that the brains of teenagers are very different than childhood brains or adult brains. And even though we have more adults who have depression than teenagers, teenage years end at 24 and adult years go all the way until death. So every year, percentage-wise, a teenager is more at risk for depression than an adult is, but we still have more adults who have depression. And untreated depression is the #1 cause of suicide. And yet less than 33% of teens with depression get help. So that means that we run the risk at all times of kids who could get significantly worse because of this very real, very common, and very treatable disorder. In fact, we do know that the suicide rate went up from 2014 to 2018 by 57%. 57% before we hit COVID. Now, that means that something else was going on in our society, but we went from losing 5,000 teenagers to 6,120 teenagers in that short 4-year period. And we went from having 600,000 kids showing up in an emergency room because of suicidal thoughts or suicidal behavior to 1.2 million. That means that every 30 seconds in the United States, there's a teenager who's showing up in an emergency room because of thoughts of wanting to hurt themselves or because of self-harm behavior. Next slide, please. So moodiness versus depression. So depression is not just a bad mood. In fact, if we think about the human condition, when bad things happen, we feel bad, and that's normal. In fact, it's unusual that if we fail a test, if a girl or guy rejects us, if we don't make the football team and we've been trying out, or we don't get the part in the show, or if we're an adult and we make a bad investment, or our boss is critical of us, it will affect our mood. The distinguishing difference is that when you have depression, it affects duration, severity, and it also affects different areas of your life. And in fact, it doesn't need to have a bad event to make you feel irritable or down in the dumps. Can I have the next slide? So when we think about symptoms of depression in teenagers versus adults, so if I get depressed, my mood will get sad. In fact, if you drag me to a party, which I have no desire to go to because I'm so depressed, I can depress the party. I will undereat, I will undersleep, I'll have insomnia, I will not have any interest in getting pleasure. And in fact, I will lose my appetite for the hunt and my appetite for the feast. So what does that mean? It means that even if you give me my favorite food in front of me, if I'm depressed, I won't eat it. It'll taste like cardboard or it'll be tasteless. And yet, if I'm a teenager, while I may lose the hunt, that desire to go search for pizza after school, if someone puts the pizza in front of me, I will eat it, and it can be quite delicious. The same thing goes for, the opposite sex or having some kind of interaction that may have romance or some physicality to it. I won't hunt down a girlfriend or a boyfriend, but if someone comes to me, I'm going to be able to make out and have a good time, which is what's so confusing to parents who say, I don't get it. He's so upset. He's oversleeping. He takes a nap when he's after school. He won't come down to have dinner. But if his girlfriend comes over, I could tell they're fooling around and he's laughing and things seem to be happening upstairs. So what does that mean? The teenage depression is very reactive to the environment. And when adults get depressed, which is classic depression versus atypical depression, classic depression doesn't have that environmental sensitivity. As I said before, whether I'm home alone or you drag me to the party, I am down in the dumps, I am sad, and you can feel my sadness, versus teenagers actually look more irritable than sad. So it's a more difficult diagnosis to make than when we talk about adults. Next slide, please. When we take a quick look at the brain, which is really an amazing phenomenon that's occurred in the last 25 to 30 years with CAT scans and then MRIs and then functional MRIs, we can actually see a difference on the brain of teenagers who are depressed versus teenagers who aren't depressed. And what we're really looking for is we'd like to get to the point where we can tell the difference between a teenager who's depressed, a teenager who's got anxiety, and a teenager who's got ADHD. So one atypical brain versus another atypical brain. But what we have now is we can tell typical versus atypical. And if you look to the left, we see in that depressed scan that there's a lot less yellow. And yellow is the serotonin. So what we're looking for is that we know that when you don't have enough serotonin hanging around your brain and that you're eating it or metabolizing too quickly, that's what we're going to see in teenagers who have depression. So what does that mean? It means that when there's a group of people that when you stress them, they need a higher diet of serotonin. And so when they're stressed, their brain is metabolizing it quickly. And when we give them medicines, the medicine that we give them is called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. The way to think about it is that we're clogging up the drain. So we're not letting the serotonin leave the brain as quickly. Now, SSRIs, by the way, Prozac-like medicines, have been around since the 80s. They are remarkably safe. There have never been any deaths from overdose with SSRIs. I mean, we make jokes about the fact that the way someone can really hurt you with an SSRI, it has to be in a very big jar and it has to fall off the shelf. But SSRIs don't have cardiovascular effects. And so you need to start with a very low dose and you have to wait at least 2 to 4 weeks before it kicks in. So these are not feel-good medicines. But more importantly, they have to pass through something called the blood-brain barrier. They have to be able to get through there and be able to clog up those drains so that the serotonin is hanging around. The important point for you to know is that even when you take an SSRI, those teenagers still don't have as much serotonin available to them as the average teenager, but they're getting closer. And so when you have more serotonin available, you're able to participate in realistic psychotherapy, in being able to understand that your brain is playing tricks on you. Can I have the next slide? So the worst outcome, obviously, is suicide. So that you feel, the next slide, please. Suicide is not caused by depression. Depression is a risk factor that may lead to suicide, but suicide is truly caused by hopelessness. That's the common symptom. And we have to remember that when you have an adolescent brain, you feel everything a lot more. So we hate you, we love you, we are boiling, we are freezing. And it's really interesting that if your child comes home and says, I had the most horrible day, I hate school, that saying to them, no, you don't hate school, it couldn't have been that bad, is not helpful. It's much more helpful to just accept the fact that they really feel that. And while it may scare us, it is more appropriate for us to accept what they are experiencing, even though we know it's very intense and even though we know it's brief. So while suicide is the second leading cause of death among children and young adults between 10 and 24, a more chilling statistic is that the leading cause of death of 15-year-old females worldwide is suicide. That's such a disturbing piece of information because it's not accidents, it's not starvation, it's not miscarriage, it's not homicide, it's suicide worldwide. So that means that girls are more susceptible to depression. And when we look at the entire world, it pops that females are struggling even more than males, even though males are more likely to complete suicide than making suicide attempts. So as I said before, the number jumped before COVID hit to over 6,000 youth suicides every year. Females, girls definitely try to commit suicide more frequently. They have more attempts. They tend to have less violent attempts. They're more likely to ingest pills. They're more likely to cut, versus boys are more likely to use guns, jump, or hang. And therefore, we also should know where is the risk factors. And remember, we talked about hopelessness. We know that American Indians, Alaskan Natives have the highest completion rates of suicide, followed by white adolescents. and nearly half of the children who are part of the LGBTQIA group have considered suicide. So again, think about hopelessness. If you feel that you can't accept yourself, or that society isn't accepting you, or your parents are not accepting you, that can bring on the symptom of hopelessness. 100 to 200 suicide attempts per completion. The trouble is that the more times you try, the more likely you are to complete suicide. So between 30 and 50% of those who've attempted reattempt, and more than 50% of attempters fail to attend or complete treatment. So treatment really does work. There are certain medicines. In fact, lithium, which is used for bipolar disorder, seems to have an anti-suicidal component to it, and that many patients who are getting an SSRI and still feel suicidal, so they're taking Prozac, their depression is lifting, but they still have suicide. Adding sometimes a second medicine like lithium for a short period of time can decrease those suicidal feelings. Next slide, please. So what are the risk factors for suicide, and what are some of the protective factors? Because basically, as parents, we want to protect our kids. So the risk factors are simple. Remember, the number one symptom is hopelessness. So quite clearly, struggling with mental illness or substance abuse is going to put you at more risk. Previous suicide attempts, as I said, will put you at risk. But the biggest risk is firearms in the house. I was recently on the Today Show, and I said to Hoda, I feel like I'm being scapegoated. I get invited to the Today Show when there's a mass school shooting. And it makes it sound like it's always linked to mental illness. And the fact is that there are millions of people who struggle across the world with mental illness. And yet the United States is one of the few places that has mass school shootings. And so if we think about the fact that a gun in the house increases the risk of suicide, increases the risk of gun injury, increases the risk of an accident caused by gun, we know that guns in the house put kids at risk. And so therefore, if our house, our home, is the United States of America, and we have 400 million guns, well, we are putting our kids at risk. And so gun safety is really, really important. If you really want to own a gun, if you really think that that's important, whether it gives you pleasure for hunting, it has to be locked up. There has to be some kind of security protocol that you're following, because that's one of the biggest risks for suicide. We also know that suicide among teenagers is contagious. How is that possible? Well, if we go back to how many kids, teenagers, are depressed or have depressive symptoms, we also know that suicide is a thought that teenagers may keep in their head without taking any action, which is something adults don't keep in their head. So there is these demoralizing moments where I feel absolutely awful. I wish I wasn't here. I wish I was dead. I can't believe he or she rejected me. I can't believe how inadequate I feel. And so maybe if I wasn't here, it would all be better. When somebody else commits suicide in a public way, it actually increases my risk of making an attempt. It's one of the reasons why we're so firm with schools not to have big memorial services after someone commits suicide, and we glorify them. And by glorifying them, we are glorifying the suicide itself. I had great differences with producers of 13 Reasons Why. And that was because this girl who committed suicide had more social capital and more social influence in death than she had when she was alive. The fact that her locker was filled with flowers and that people were feeling about her and thinking about her, even though they never paid attention to her when she was alive, was exactly the opposite message that we want to give teenagers. And in fact, I went on the Today Show and said, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when someone will copy what happened on the TV program. And it did. It happened in Peru. It happened in the United States. There were multiple attempts. And when I literally went to Netflix and talked to them about it in Los Angeles, they actually told me, don't worry, in the second season, no one else kills themselves. And so I think they really missed the message, was that the dead girl still had power and was being shown as a glorified figure. And so it wasn't, in fact, that other kids were committing suicide. It was telling teenagers watching the show that suicide is actually an option, and it's not an option. And in fact, those individuals who have attempted suicide and have survived the suicide attempt will tell you, particularly jumpers, that the minute they jumped, they changed their mind. So that one has to really talk about how lethal, how permanent a suicide attempt is to a temporary condition. We also know that, kids who are struggling with sexual identity, kids who are struggling with with acceptance of themselves and by others are more at risk. Kids who are failing, again, anything that causes hopelessness. But let's talk about the things that could protect our kids and protect our teenagers. So when we talk about the word family connectedness, I know that most parents say, you got to be kidding. I can't, every time I sit with him, he's critical, he's irritable, it's so unpleasant. And so that means that you have to start paying into the bank. You start making deposits when your children are children, not teenagers, so that you have started rituals like family dinners that are 10, 15, 20 minutes every night. And if that doesn't work, then we do Sunday brunch or we do Friday night evening dinner. And we put in rituals that will make it easy for us to talk, which means that parents have to describe why it was a good day or a good week or a bad week to show some kind of gratitude or some challenge that they were able to rise to. So in our family, we used to do it on Friday evening, and we would go around the table and we'd have to talk about why we were lucky, and then another time around why we were happy. We couldn't tell you the difference between happy or lucky, but it became a running joke that we couldn't define the difference between lucky and happiness. But nevertheless, it gave us an opportunity to go around, and you weren't allowed to repeat what someone else said. So if one of the kids came out and said, oh, I feel so lucky it's Friday, I don't have school tomorrow, that was taken. But it also gave you an opportunity to tell you when you weren't unlucky or when you were unhappy and why you were unhappy. And we were trying also not to make unhappiness based on a bad grade or a bad performance in athletics. But if that really made you unhappy, then we talked about it. And by the way, we did that even if our kids had guests at the table. So our kids were embarrassed, but the guests actually thought it was so cool. I can't believe you do this every Friday night. But it was an easy thing for us to figure out that there was a ritual where there was connectedness, where we could keep our eyes on our kids. And the important part about that is that kids get busier and busier when they're teenagers. That song, Cat's Cradle, the Cats in the Cradle, that talks about the fact that if you don't invest time and attention early on, it's very hard to expect time and attention back from your teenager. And, when parents always ask me, what is the essential part of parenting? I always say it's quality time and it's attention. And quality time, by the way, can be measured. You can't have the screen on, you can't be looking at your phone, you can't be reading to yourself. You could be preparing food together, you could be shopping together, but no one else is interfering. And if your spouse is in the room, then you have to cut the quality time in half because you only get half of that time. And you have 2 or 3 kids, we have 3 kids, you have to divide it by a third. And you'd be shocked to find out that on average, American families spend very little quality time with their kids. They're watching TV, they are taking phone calls, they're looking at their devices. And so working moms versus non-working moms, the difference is very small. It's almost more like 8 minutes a day versus 10 minutes a day. And dads do particularly poorly because very often they leave early in the morning, they come back when the kid's asleep, and they haven't logged in that necessary time. Reading with your child does count. And again, starting rituals like every night dad is going to read a book to the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old, it becomes easy later on when the kid reads to you. And when the kid's a teenager and you're not going to lie in bed together, well, then you can go into the room and have a conversation for 5 or 10 minutes. You get to understand your kid's behavior, their sleep patterns, what they love. And I always think that parents should treat their kids like clients. If I have a patient, I make sure that I look up baseball scores beforehand because I know they care about baseball. If I have a donor, I make sure I know what the donor is interested in because I want to make sure I can connect them to a valuable component of the Child Mind Institute. I think that's our responsibility with our kids. If our kids love tennis, or if our kids love costumes, or if our kids love poker or magic, it's our job to figure out how we can share that special interest with them. Certainly knowing what's going on in school is really important. And I think one of the reasons that kids have so much trouble in middle school, besides that it is a terribly disorganizing organization, because you have to go from one subject to another subject. You have to keep running to your locker. You have to keep a backpack. You have to be more organized than ever before. There's also the fact that there are now 8 teachers instead of 1, so that mom or dad doesn't have a connection. And so the homeroom teacher, if they're doing a good job, becomes your representative, that you know that they're keeping in touch with you. You also want to see who their friends are. You want to make sure, as I said again, I know it's a broken record, that if there are guns in the house, they are locked up. And you're watching how they do at school academically, because school is work. Willie Sutton used to say, when they asked him, why do you rob banks? He said, I rob banks because that's where the money is. We work with schools because that's where kids work. A teacher who's been teaching for 10 years in 3rd grade or 8th grade or 9th grade math has an experience of now hundreds of 9th grade boys and girls. And if they say something's off, that the academic performance was good and now it's bad, there seems to be some disinterest, that's a valuable observation that we should hear about when we look carefully at a report card and look at the remarks about the behavior. And also talking to kids about what their future is, not making sure that they're going to go to college or become a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman, but talking to them about the future. What do they think is going to be a fun trip this summer? What do they think they'd like to do when high school is over? Not putting pressure on them, but hearing that they should have lots of dreams. For those of you who can still remember E.T., one of my favorite movies, there was a really magical moment where the main character has E.T. in his basket, and he's pedaling on the bicycle as fast as he can, and the bicycle goes up in the air and flies. And that's something you could still believe in 5th grade, maybe 6th grade. But we also still keep on holding on to magical thoughts, even when we're in high school. We talk about thinking of becoming a professional baseball player or a basketball player, and we're not that tall, or we're not that coordinated, or we dream about being on the Broadway stage or being a television performer. And hearing about those dreams and that future is something that we want. We want kids, especially during their teenage years, to have lots and lots of aspirations, and then to recognize how much hard work it takes to fulfill that goal. But we don't want them closed off. Those are all good reasons for living. Next slide, please. So worried a child is thinking about suicide. So as I said, teenagers do think about suicide. So I think the most important thing is don't be afraid to ask. Talking about it doesn't make kids attempt or complete suicide. So are you thinking about hurting yourself? You seem, I found pills in your drawer. You haven't been taking your medicine, or you're not going to the doctor. But one can't become hysterical. It's really important to stay calm and yet show concern. And you want them to talk about their feelings. And if they say things like I brought up before, I wish I was dead, you don't say, no, you don't. Even though inside your head, you're really troubled that your child, who you care for, that you feed, that you clothe, that you worry about, would think about the unthinkable, about ending their life. You want to hear what they're saying without judgment, without making them feel that they can't share this, and without also coming up with quick solutions. My mother and father were Eastern European. My father actually graduated law school before the war, and my mother was in law school. But after the war, she went and became a social worker. And yet, when I would complain to her about how bad the day was in high school, I don't think my mother could tolerate it, and would literally say, the Holocaust is over, the war is over, don't worry. And I remember eventually saying to her, please don't minimize how badly I feel. I'm delighted that the Holocaust is over, but that doesn't take away from how I'm feeling. And what we want from our parents is understanding. We don't want them to suggest that suicide is an option, but we definitely want to be able to listen. They should be able to know that we can hear them. And if we have concerns, well, then we're going to reach out and get help. I think one of the most important things to tell a child is not that they're ill, but that they're struggling and they're suffering, and that it's my job as your parent to make sure that you don't feel terrible, that you don't, that you're healthy, and that if you get a rash or if you get pneumonia, I'm going to make sure we go to the doctor and make sure you take an antibiotic. And so in the same way that if you are struggling with your feelings, then we're going to go to a mental health professional and figure out how we can make it easier for you in school or easier in life in general. I think it's kind of amazing that it's taken the United States so long, but isn't it? We should all be grateful that we now have a number that's not for only emergencies, but for suicide or mental health conditions, 988. And the reason for that is that most police are not been trained in how to deal with that. And so we hear about these terrible events that happen when you call 911 and a policeman comes and you have a teenager who looks menacing and frightening and has a knife in his hand, may want to hurt themselves, and somehow it lands up with a homicide or it lands up with an injury to this very ill patient. So 988, something that every parent who has a teenager should know about. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what parents can actually do and how easy it is to fall into the trap of, I'm really worried about them and I want the best for them, so I'm going to do everything for them, okay? So whether you're a helicopter parent or a concierge parent, you know, I love that term. Can I get you a better class? Can I get you a better table? Can I get you a better teacher? Can I get you a better school? Can I get you a better tutor? Which, or the snowplow parents, they have one thing in common. They are swooping in, and the message they're giving to their teenager, and certainly to their children, is you are incompetent. You are not capable. I have to be here to fix it. Can I have the next slide, please? So I wrote a book, which is really about scaffolding. It's called, it's one of those interesting books that in hardcover, it's called The Scaffold Effect, and in paperback, it's called Scaffolding Parenting, but it's really the same. The idea is, how do you raise a resilient, self-reliant, and secure kid in an age of anxiety? And this book was written just before, it was written before COVID hit. It was actually recorded on Audible during COVID, which is an experience that I wouldn't wish anyone, being in a glass box and having to keep repeating yourself again and again when you misread a line of your book. But I think that the important message here is that your child is a building, and the building might turn out to be a skyscraper, or it might be in a bungalow, or it might be a split level, and the child's going to live in it. And the scaffolding, which is what the parent is really going to give support. It's going to help that building turn into the building that it's going to be, and it's going to be a strong, sturdy building, because good parenting is not about swooping in or rescuing kids. Can I have the next slide? So the model we're looking at, and it's a metaphor, is the fact that you need to have pillars while you're building a house or building a home. And that needs structure, it needs support, it needs encouragement. And so think about it, it's different than what we would do for a 5-year-old, what we would do for a 15-year-old. But if we do this properly, we know that when a child goes to college, that what we're going to see is a child who is going to be able to scaffold themselves, so that if they need mental health help, or if they need learning help, they go to the learning center. They don't need to call mom or dad. They have learned that it's okay, because I know when I need support. I know when I need structure. And I also know when I'm going to get encouragement that's real, that isn't going to be telling me that I'm a great basketball player when I need to practice more if I'm going to get on the team, or if I want to get on the soccer team and they told us that we have to run 100 miles during the summer, that the structure mom and dad is going to give and saying, well, let's figure this out. We have 90 days. You need to run 100 miles. How do you want to break it up? Would you like my help? Would you like me to run with you? Would you like me to set up a calendar? That's the kind of encouragement that we're going to give, that isn't fake, that isn't smoke blowing and telling a child that there's something that they aren't. Can I have the next slide? And then you have planks. Those are the other important pieces of being a parent that's going to scaffold your child properly. And that's to have dispassion. I happen to be very bad at dispassion. I'm one of those fathers on the sidelines of soccer where I am screaming and yelling, follow the ball, defense, defense. And dispassion is really very important at times, to be able to listen carefully and to give your child an honest answer. an honest, but not necessarily critical, but constructive answer without overdoing it, without being too enthusiastic or catastrophizing the situation. And patience is essential, even with teenagers who will repeat the story again and again, how they're stuck and they're stuck and they're stuck and they feel hopeless. And you have to be patient and listen, and sometimes just let that teenager vent without fixing it. And in fact, sometimes it's helpful to say to your teenager, are you asking me for advice? Do you want me to do something? Or do you just want to let me hear you out and listen and be supportive? Monitoring, I think, is the most important. I think that if we're good parents and we're good scaffolds, we know how our kids eat, we know what they like, we know how they sleep, we know who their friends are, we know what they desire. And when we see a shift, when we see that someone who is really interested in watching a certain basketball team stop watching, or we know that a child who really loves ice cream has lost their interest in any sweets, that should be a red flag that something is going on. And very often it's more likely to be depression than almost anything else, or an anxiety disorder. And so monitoring our children, not giving them surveillance, but keeping tabs on who our kids are and if there's a change in behavior, in attitude, and sleep. Those are important things that parents have to look out for. We also have to be aware that if there's a shift in of all of a sudden behavior, that might be substances might be playing into it. And I also believe that warmth is really important, but warmth means that you're sharing. And so if you don't believe in premarital sex, then you've been talking to your kids about why they should wait. Or if you worry that marijuana could be very toxic to your child, because anxious kids shouldn't really be using marijuana, they're more likely to precipitate a panic attack, then you have to talk about it. And you have to be able to keep talking, not lecturing, and keep those lines of communication open, even when they're a teenager. Because while the peer group has become more powerful than it ever was before, parents' attitudes, parents' beliefs still remain the biggest influence on a teenager's life. And for most of us, we back off because we're afraid they're not going to listen to us. So, the reason why most of us vote the way our parents voted is because we got spoon-fed that at the dining room table. They talked about whether they had conservative values, liberal values, whether they admired one politician versus the other. And so talking about those things, talking about spirituality, talking about religious beliefs are really something that parents still have a lot of importance. And that doesn't mean that you're going to mandate things, but you're going to be talking about it in a warm, supportive way. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we're talking about laying a foundation. It's not quick. It's not throw the cement down. This is something that we've been doing since the child is born, and it becomes just much more important once puberty has hit. So being mentally present and emotionally available sounds easy, but it means that it needs time and attention. That when your child says, or especially a teenager, that they want to talk to you, that's the time to put down the phone, tell whoever you're talking to or whoever you're emailing that you'll be back in 20 minutes. And that the most important part is that you want your teenager to have emotional regulation. And that's hard for most teenagers. They go from 0 to 60. It's kind of like they have a Ferrari, but with no brakes. And so it's very easy for them to provoke us, and that we will demonstrate emotional dysregulation instead of able to be calm, so that when they say terrible things like, I hate you, you're the worst parent, you're stupid, that you can say, you're behaving in an insulting way and you're being very hurtful, but tell me what's really bothering you. Instead of saying, you think you're such a good kid. In other words, tit for tat doesn't work. Getting down to their level is the biggest mistake. We have to demonstrate and model that emotional regulation. So we just have to try to be kind. And if we go back to what I said earlier about shared attachment rituals, that's talking about that dinner or that holiday celebration. Or, I'll use myself as an example. I have 3 sons, and my oldest son is the quietest of the 3. And it was always very difficult to get him to share what was going on. And I decided that in the mornings, before he'd go to school and before I go to work, we would go and go for a jog, and we lived near Central Park, and so we'd run around the reservoir. And it became clear that he was not going to be a chatterbox, and frankly, I was out of breath, so it was hard for me to talk. But we'd go around 2 times, and when we went around the second time, that's when Joshua would start to share something that went on at school, or a fight that he's having with a friend, or a good grade that he got. And so we gave each other a space that was really quite important. And it's really interesting because we started running in road runners races, and he turned out to be very gifted at this. So he was running way ahead of me and winning, for his age group. And I was just desperately trying to finish the race and hope that I wouldn't have a heart attack. And, saying, just finish, one foot in front of the other. And what really stopped that wonderful ritual is that people started paying attention. There was a reporter who caught us jogging and asked if he would be able to do a story for us for an airplane magazine. Now, this is so many years ago that it was actually for the TWA magazine. TWA doesn't exist anymore. And then after it was in the TWA magazine, it was in Women's Digest, also doesn't exist. But the fact that there was a photograph of the two of us, and that meant that when we went back to jogging around the reservoir, someone pointed out to us and say, hey, I saw you in that magazine. That ruined the magic. That special ritual we had that was just between him and me got destroyed. And it was my fault. I should have said to the reporter, and I thought it was so cool, that no, we're not interested in that kind of publicity. So whether it's taking your kid to a diner on Saturday morning, or you're the one who takes them to the reading tutor, it's being in the car together, not talking on the phone to somebody else, but being with them. And that's spending that non-judgmental quality time, just talking, not saying you should have done this or you shouldn't have done that. And I think the most important rule on this page is use labeled praise. So what does that mean? It means catching your child being good, catching your teenager in particular being good. So you've asked them 4 times to set the table, but they now set the table. So instead of saying, are you deaf? How many times do I have to ask you to set the table? You actually say, thank you very much for setting the table. You did a really good job. I really am pleased that you are so helpful. Thank you. People don't talk that way. Or when he cleans up and you say, thank you so much for cleaning up. It makes me feel really good that I don't have to do this by myself and that you're doing such a good job. We teach teachers to do this all the time. We say to teachers, we want you to reinforce raising your hand, not calling out. So the teacher asked, who discovered America? And the answer that she's looking for is Christopher Columbus. And some kid screams out Christopher Columbus, and she actively ignores that off-task behavior. And then she asks the next kid, and the next kid says Mickey Mantle. But she raised her hand. Thank you for raising your hand. I really appreciate it that you're following the rules. That's not the correct answer. Who else? And they keep going around the room until they find someone who raised their hand and came up with the right answer. So everyone in the room sees that they're pleasing the teacher by following directions, by following requests. And that's what we mean by labeled praise. Catch your kid being good. Told you a funny story. Shared some very private stuff that's going on in school. Thank you so much for trusting me with that story. And it was really a great story. Or thank you for sharing that joke or explaining that joke to me, because now I understand it. We want you doing that as often as possible. And by the way, your kid in the beginning will think you're not being real, but after a while, you're going to get more and more positive behavior out of your teenager because your teenager wants you to like them. Your teenager wants the teacher to praise them. Can I have the next slide, please? And we want you to empower growth. So that means do less, very hard, sit on your hands, be supportive, be encouraging. My favorite line is to my grown-up children, I am sure it's all going to work out. Because the fact is that your kids can do much more than they want to do, than they think they can do, or sometimes that they want to do. And so what you want them to do is not only be in their comfort zone, but you want them to be outside that comfort zone, which is called growth. And so it's risky out there. They may fail, but no one's ever died of embarrassment. The story in the book that I use is about my oldest son in middle school and how it changed in many ways the way I thought about him and the way he thought about himself. In 5th grade, he was in middle school, and they had a middle school assembly that went on right before Thanksgiving. And he came home and announced that he and his friend Adam were going to do a rap dance in honor of Michael Jordan. And I thought to myself, this seems absurd. You're going to dance in front of the entire middle school. This is inside my head, not outside my mouth. And you could make a fool of yourself and you'll be labeled by all these people as a fool, as a goof. And I sit with patients who tell me about these embarrassing moments that happen and that they can't get over it. And yet my wife, who's very shy, said, oh, it sounds like it's going to be great. 3 days before the performance, he comes home and he says, Adam's decided not to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm thinking, this is getting worse instead of better. The day of the performance comes. My wife happens to be a middle school teacher there, so she's in the back of the assembly. I'm not there. And frankly, even if I could have changed my schedule, I think I would be cringing in the back. And it turns out to be terrific, at least according to my wife's report. Fast forward 20 years, Josh was 30 years old. We're at his birthday party and we're invited. And one of his closest friends gets up and says, you know, I've been living with Joshua for 7 years. I lived with him in college and then after college. And I just want you to know that the first time I laid eyes on him, I was in 4th grade, he was in 5th grade. And they announced that Josh Koplewicz from House 52 was going to do an interpretive dance in honor of Michael Jordan. And the lights went off and there was Joshua with his hat, baseball hat backwards, wearing the Chicago Bulls basketball outfit, very baggy, and crisscross came on, and Joshua started spinning, and he flipped over, and the crowd went wild. And he got up, and people were screaming, "Go, Josh!" And 10 minutes later, it was over. And I couldn't get over how brave he was. And the very next time I saw him was Monday after Thanksgiving, and there he was, as unobtrusive as always, carrying too many books and his head down. But I talked to my parents all the time, says his friend Elias, about how brave Josh was, and that Joshua could be brave, I could be brave too. Letting my son go into that growth zone, letting him take the risk of embarrassment, which he wouldn't have died from, but working hard on the dance, working with the dance teacher, working out with that music, finding that costume, all turned out to be very important. He later on in high school became a DJ. He did it during his college years. If anything, I think in many ways it was more valuable than those jobs that we took, but it was hard as a parent to do less. Instead of I was ready to tell him all the risks that were involved. And he was lucky that his mom said, I'm sure it's going to work out. It sounds great. So being able to empower that growth becomes very important if we want to have independent teenagers. Next slide, please. And we want them to build strength. We want them to wait to eat the marshmallow and get 2 marshmallows. We want them to understand that you can't always get what you want immediately, that there's always hard work, and that to make kids have stronger, promote them to have courage and resilience and confidence means that we have to step away. They know that they can fail because we will catch them, but we won't fix it so that everything will work out. Next. And I think this is the hard part, because our kids are going to start dressing in ways when they become teenagers, having ideas, listening to music that we might not like, having some friends that are a little out there. And that requires us to support them unconditionally. We can be honest, we can be accepting, but we want them to make the decisions. And we want to try to join in interest if possible. So if they're protesting something, if they love something, we're going to go and watch the dance or go and watch the sporting event. And we're going to recognize that it's our job to help them enhance their assets and to objectively try to help them with their deficits. If that's a math tutor, if that's a special course that they take during the summer. So we're helping reshape deficits into assets. We're not minimizing the deficits by telling them that they don't exist. We're honest with our teenagers. Yes, next slide. And the best news is you get to take the scaffold down. In fact, think about a building. The scaffolding only comes back up if the tiles are falling off, or if a brick pops out, or if the roof needs to be replaced. So making wise decisions and problem solving and having emotional intelligence and standing up for herself are all the things that we really want, and we want them to occur by the time they're 18 or 19. And if they come back to us and say, I need some help, we can put the scaffolding back up temporarily. But remember, what we really want is independent kids. And even if they choose to live in a quirky Victorian house instead of that sleek condo we had for them, they get to live in the house, not us. And so it's our job to help them become whatever they really want to become. I have to tell you, I thought we had a DJ on our hands. And so we thought he was going to go to Brown, and from Brown, he was going to go to LA. Somehow there was a diversion, and he decided he wanted to go work at a bank. We were kind of shocked, but we figured, okay, we'll just adjust the scaffolding, because at the end of the day, what he does every day is his job, not our job. Very hard, but if we do it correctly, we get a child who's resilient, and they turn into an adult that's self-reliant, and we hope happy and satisfied with what they do for a living, and who they pick for a mate, and how they want to spend their time doing leisure activities or pleasurable activities. Next slide. So parenting, in my opinion, is the hardest task. And while there's no guidebook, here I wrote a book about it, there are ways for us to think about the fact that we can become a much better parent by doing less. I know that's hard, considering that most of us worry, they very often feel easily guilty about things that our kids struggle with, but stepping back and watching and monitoring and being careful about what we say and when we intervene can really help our kids become self-reliant adults. And that's truly the most important task we have as parents. Thank you.
Well, the few minutes that you spent with us are truly a guide for every parent pre-COVID and now post-COVID. We don't have a choice, do we? We must do all of these things.
Yeah, so let's just talk about an important statistic I gave, which is about 30%, or maybe in some cases 50% of the kids who have a mental health disorder. There's 17 million kids in America who have a mental health disorder, and at best, it's 50% of those kids get help. We think in most cases it's 30%. So COVID has been bad for everyone, particularly for that 70% of kids who were struggling and not getting help. So all of a sudden, we have to be more supportive, more encouraging, but at the same time, we have to stop ourselves from saying we're going to fix it. So for instance, 13 to 24-year-olds had the worst time with COVID than you and me, Gilda. It's just, it was bad. It will be forgotten. In a life that's 50 years old or 60 years old, it's going to be a blip. But if you missed out on algebra, if you missed out on making the varsity team, if you missed out on your junior prom or senior prom, or your freshman year at college was all done remotely, there's no makeup for that. We're not giving that back to you. That's a sacrifice. That's a trauma that you experience. I don't think we have to feel sorry for our kids, but we have to be understanding that they have taken a hit that is more significant than the one we did. And that means that, getting them back into routine, getting them back into school, making sure that they're exercising, making sure that we're giving them as many opportunities as possible has become essential for us. I mean, I think the reason why the Child Mind Institute is raising more funds now and coming up with videos for parents and doing programming to identify high school students who might want to become mental health professionals and looking at apps and devices is because America is finally paying attention to children's mental health, because everyone has seen that their kids have struggled. Even if they didn't have a mental health disorder, mental health is essential for physical health. It's essential when the Surgeon General talks about it. It's essential when the Academy of Pediatrics says these are the most common disorders. So it took a global pandemic for us to pay attention to it, but it means that unfortunately for parents, we have a little more of a task. That means we have to monitor somewhat more carefully. We have to be more supportive. We have to be more encouraging than ever before.
Beautiful. Janet, I know you have a question.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how schools and parents could team around the scaffolding idea to help students grow.
So we actually were approached by the state of California last year because of their concerns about how do you get kids back into school. And we came up with the idea that how can we take this to scale? How can we reach 300,000 teachers and 6 million kids? And what is the essential feature of building resilience, of making them more robust? And we broke it down to 5 things. So understanding our feelings, relaxation skills, understanding our thoughts, managing emotional stress, and mindfulness. And could we teach this in Spanish and in English? and give teachers curriculum and parents parenting tips by using videos. The state of California gave us $25 million. And so we spent about $8 million with a professional movie maker, and we sent a team of clinicians out to California to make sure that these were developmentally appropriate and clinically on target. And these videos, which are now available for free, it's called the California Healthy Minds, Thriving Kids Project, on our website. So childmind.org, and you just look up Healthy Minds, Thriving Kids, and you can get the 10 videos for elementary school, or the 10 that you have for middle school, and the 10 that you have for high school. But 5 are in Spanish and 5 are in English, and they were built from the ground up in different languages. And the ones that are for elementary school kids use whimsical storytelling with hedgehogs. I have to tell you, I was a little taken back with the hedgehogs, but it turns out hedgehogs are very important and very likable characters for elementary school kids. And for middle school and high school kids, we used 62 real live students who were very honest about the struggles that they're having. And we used a Spanish-speaking comedian and an English-speaking comedian to work with them. On top of that, we did 4 videos for parents and teachers, and we used Danny Pino, an actor from Law and Order, and the dad in Dear Evan Hansen. And we found that we were able to be successful because we incentivized teachers with $100 if they spent a half an hour on these videos, and we marketed it using Facebook and Instagram. We got 78,000 teachers to watch these videos, use these videos, and now they're reporting back that 91% of the teachers using them are saying how helpful it is for their kids. And we're now trying to get parents to use these videos too. So it would be wonderful if Glenbard would be able to say, let's send this link out. Why don't you take a look at this? It's 25 minutes, basically, of 5 videos for your elementary school kid, and having a conversation afterwards and talking to them about what's important, why this is valuable for them, is really, it's a set of skills that I frankly think we all could use. It will make all of us feel a bit more in control, a bit more resilient and robust during a very scary time still. I mean, I'm glad President Biden has told us COVID is over. I think the psychological tail of COVID is going to last another 10 years.
Maria came on screen, and she has been so helpful about this. We're going to be able to share the slides. We're going to be able to share the recording. I have one last question before we say goodbye to you. There are children, high school children, who will be hearing this in class. What do you want those high school kids to know about suicide? What do the kids need to know?
So suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary condition. It is not a solution. And I accept that there are moments that we can be incredibly, incredibly hopeless, where we feel that there's no solution to the dilemma that we're in. And I think that the most important thing we can do, whether we're the person feeling that hopelessness or we have a friend who's feeling that hopelessness, is to share with someone else that you're experiencing this trouble. We know that when you share, we are able to get you help. There is no reason to feel as miserable or as hopeless as you are, and that we can make you feel better. It's not a quick fix, but there are solutions, and suicide is not one.
Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again later this evening. So have a good evening, good afternoon, Dr. K. Thank you so much, Harold. Thank you, Maria. Janet, you're going to stay on with us for just a few more minutes to give us some closing comments.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. GPS did it again. Had a wonderful opportunity to learn about our kids, to learn about what we could do together to support students, to support the young people in our houses, and to avoid, as Harold said at the end, a permanent act. It is no solution. I think as far as one person, getting to listen to him, I know I have a lot more I want to learn. I want to get on his website. I want to think about how can I apply that to my practice professionally and my life personally. I hope all of you today have that same kind of feeling, is there's more to learn, there's more to do, and we're all a team together. So thank you all for coming to GPS today.
That was great. We have a lot more to learn. And when you give us the trust of your time, we're so grateful about that. Janet, thank you so much. Thank you, Jarek, behind the scenes. Thank you, all of those who listened in. Call someone. We'll be back tonight, 7 p.m. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.